The most dangerous weapon in Hollywood history wasn't a contract, it was silence. In a windowless room in 1960, Marlon Brando proved it. You might know him as the Godfather, the man with the cotton in his cheeks, but that legend was born in the ashes of the moment we are about to analyze. Before the awards, before the applause, and before the tragedy, there was a trap set by the most powerful men in the entertainment industry to break the will of their most profitable asset. They thought they had him cornered. They thought they possessed the ultimate leverage. But by the time Brando walked out of that room, the power dynamic of global cinema had shifted forever, and he did it without raising his voice. To understand the gravity of this standoff, you have to understand the era. It is the tail end of the golden age. The studio system, once an invincible fortress that owned actors like cattle, is a dying beast. It is bleeding money, terrified of television, and paralyzed by antitrust laws. When empires fall, they become vicious. They needed control. Marlon Brando represented everything they hated. He was the chaotic element, the method actor who mumbled and improvised while the old guard stood straight and obeyed orders. He was the future, they were the past, and they wanted to punish him for it. The setting was psychologically deliberate, a small, claustrophobic conference room in the backlot of a major Los Angeles studio. No windows, one heavy door. The air conditioning was purposely set too low, a subtle interrogation tactic designed to make the occupant physically uncomfortable. The air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and expensive cologne. Sitting on one side of the heavy oak table were three executives. Let's call them the architects. Men in gray suits who viewed movies as products, indistinguishable from soap or tires. On the other side sat Brando. He wasn't the heavy figure of his later years yet. He was still the physical specimen from Streetcar, but he looked weary, not sleepy, but weary of the soul. The meeting began with a lecture. For 20 agonizing minutes, the head executive spoke. He listed Brando's infractions with the precision of a prosecutor. The lateness, the budget overruns, the attitude. It was a calculated dressing down intended to humiliate. They had a file in front of them, a dossier of his sins. The ultimatum was clear: sign a new restrictive contract that gave the studio total control, or be blacklisted. In 1960, a blacklist was a career death sentence. They expected him to fight. They wanted him to scream. They had security waiting outside to escort an out-of-control star off the premises for the perfect photo op. But Brando didn't scream. He didn't even speak. He sat low in his chair, eyes fixed on a scratch on the table. He was utilizing a psychological technique that would define his career: the weaponization of dead air. In a negotiation, the person who speaks first loses. Silence creates a vacuum, and human nature compels us to fill it. The executives grew uncomfortable. The leader cleared his throat, waiting for a rebuttal that didn't come. Brando just breathed, rhythmically, turning his body into a fortress. Finally, Brando moved. The executives flinched. He reached into his pocket. Was it a resignation? A weapon? No. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He tapped one out, lit it, and took a long drag. The click of the lighter sounded like a gunshot. He exhaled a plume of gray smoke and watched it dissipate. He still hadn't looked at them. By refusing to acknowledge their threat, he was stripping it of its power. He was telling them, without a word, that their reality meant nothing to him. The leader, frustrated, slammed his hand on the table. He escalated the threat. He brought up Brando's personal life, the rumors, the debts. "You need us, Marlon," he hissed. "Without the machine, you're just a mumbler in a t-shirt." This was the curiosity gap moment. The executives thought the dynamic was master versus servant, but Brando knew the truth. The studios were desperate. Their stock prices were plummeting. They didn't need a servant. They needed a savior. And Brando was the only star who could guarantee a global opening weekend. Brando finally looked up. His eyes held a terrifying, cold curiosity. He leaned forward and asked a question that had nothing to do with the contract. He asked about the lighting in the hallway. He asked why a company that sold dreams couldn't afford to change a flickering bulb. It was a masterclass in distraction. It threw the executives off their script. They were prepared for legal battles, not existential absurdity. While they stammered, Brando reached for the file, the death warrant of his freedom. He didn't open it. He simply placed his hand over it. Then, he pulled a crumpled, coffee-stained napkin from his pocket and slid it across the table. "These are my terms," he whispered. The voice was barely audible, forcing them to lean in to hear. The leader picked up the napkin. He expected a joke, But as he read, his face went pale. Brando wasn't asking for money. He was asking for power, creative control, director approval, the right to change the script. In the 1960s, actors were employees. They didn't make demands like this. It was a declaration of war. The executive laughed nervously. "This is impossible," he said. "No one gets this." Brando stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. "Then get someone else," he said. He turned to the door. It was the ultimate bluff. If he walked out, their summer movie collapsed. The financing would evaporate. The board would fire them, not Brando. In that split second, the executives did the math. They realized a difficult Brando was worth more than a compliant nobody. "Wait," the leader said. Brando paused, hand on the doorknob. He didn't turn around. He let them sit in their sweat. Then, slowly, he turned back. The power had shifted. The architects were now the beggars. They agreed to look at the terms. They agreed to negotiate. Brando didn't smile. He just nodded, sat down, and lit another cigarette. He had one. But as he sat there, watching them scramble, Brando realized something tragic. This wasn't a victory for art. It was a transaction of power. He had exposed the hollowness of the industry. They didn't care about quality. They cared about leverage. And now that he had shown he could be more ruthless than them, he knew they would never forgive him. The prophecy of that room was simple. Brando would get what he wanted, but he would pay for it with his reputation. The studio agreed to his terms, but the moment he left, the whisper campaign began. They leaked stories to the press. They painted him as a spoiled, lazy diva. They created the narrative of the monster to protect their egos. And the tragedy is, the world believed them. This leads us to the set of Mutiny on the Bounty, the battlefield, where the Cold War turned hot. Armed with absolute control, Brando arrived on set, not as an actor, but as an adversary. The studio had granted him power, hoping he would hang himself with it. And in a way, he did. But not out of incompetence. Out of a desperate search for truth, in a production designed to be artificial. The press reported Brando was delaying production, costing millions. They said he was too fat for the costumes. They said he refused to come out of his trailer. What they didn't report was why. Brando saw the script, a cliché historical romance, and hated it. He realized he had trapped himself in a blockbuster with no soul. So, he rebelled in the only way he knew how. By slowing everything down, he weaponized time. A movie set burns money by the minute. By stalling, Brando was holding the studio's wallet hostage, trying to force them to rewrite scenes, to add depth. He would stand on set, hundreds of extras waiting in the heat, and stare at the horizon. The director would yell, "Cut," but Brando hadn't started. He would say, "I'm not ready. The emotion isn't there." To the accountants, it was sabotage. To Brando, it was integrity. Then came the legend of the cue cards. The studio leaked a story that would haunt Brando for decades. They claimed he was so lazy he couldn't memorize lines. They painted a picture of a bloated star reading dialogue taped to actors' foreheads. It was a perfect story to sell papers. But here is the gap between headline and truth. Brando didn't use cue cards out of laziness. He used them because he was obsessed with realism. He argued that in real life, people don't know what they will say next. They search for words. By reading off a card, he forced himself to be in the moment, to find the line as the camera rolled. He wanted the anxiety of the unknown to show in his eyes. He wasn't disrespecting the job. He was elevating it to a level of realism the studio hacks couldn't comprehend. The production wrapped, but the damage was catastrophic. The budget had ballooned. The director was fired. When Mutiny on the Bounty premiered in 1962, the knives were out. The reviews were savage. Critics saw a crime scene, not a movie. They attacked his weight, his accent, his ego. Then came the death blow, the box office. The film lost millions. In Hollywood, you can survive a scandal or a crime, but you cannot survive losing money. The prophecy of the windowless room came true. The executives didn't need to fire him. The industry did it for them. The phone stopped ringing. Brando was labeled box office poison. Once you have that label, the smell never leaves. The scripts that arrived were scraps, comedies that weren't funny, action movies with no plot. He took them because he had to. The king was now a mercenary, working for a paycheck while the industry snickered. The 1960s swung into full gear. The Beatles, Vietnam, the counterculture. A new breed of actor emerged: Hoffman, Redford, Beatty. They were young, cooperative, and cheap. Brando looked like a dinosaur. He grew heavier. He grew sadder. He retreated to Mulholland Drive, watching the lights of Los Angeles, a kingdom that had exiled him. He spent the decade in a creative wilderness, punishing Hollywood by giving them exactly what they paid for, a shell of Marlon Brando. By 1970, the situation was dire. Brando was 46, but in industry years, he was ancient. He was uninsured. When his name came up, executives recoiled. "Do not speak that name," they said. "He is dead." The silence he used as a weapon in 1960 had turned against him. Now, the silence came from the world. The Zeigarnik effect seemed complete. The file was closed. The system had one. But history writes plot twists no screenwriter would dare invent. Just as Brando hit bottom, a young director named Francis Ford Coppola was struggling to adapt a pulp gangster novel called The Godfather. Paramount Pictures wanted a cheap gangster flick. They wanted a safe lead, someone reliable. Coppola saw a Shakespearean tragedy. He saw Don Vito Corleone, not as a thug, but as a king in Twilight. He knew only one man understood what it felt like to be a king who lost his empire. He needed Brando. When Coppola mentioned Brando's name, the reaction was explosive. The president of Paramount screamed, throwing his lunch across the room. "As long as I am president, Marlon Brando will never work here." The grudge was alive. They remembered the meeting room. They remembered the defiance. They hated him with a passion beyond business. This should have been the end. But Brando, sitting in his house, felt a flicker of the old fire. He read the book. For the first time in 10 years, he didn't see a paycheck. He saw a mirror. Vito Corleone was a man of silence, a man of subtle gestures. It was the role Brando had been rehearsing for his entire life. Coppola hatched a desperate plan. He couldn't hire Brando, but he could test him. He went to Brando's house with a handheld camera. It was a secret operation. He arrived early. Brando was in his kimono, hair long and gray. He looked nothing like a don. He looked like a tired man who had given up. The camera rolled. The transformation happened. It wasn't acting. It was alchemy. Brando didn't speak. He reached for shoe polish and darkened his hair. He stuffed tissues into his cheeks to weigh down his jaw. He slumped his shoulders. The sparkle of the rebel vanished, replaced by the weary, dangerous wisdom of a patriarch. He began to mumble, a low rasp from the bottom of a well. He sniffed a rose. He sipped espresso. In 3 minutes, without a script, Brando erased 10 years of failure. He proved that talent hadn't gone. It was hibernating. Coppola took the tape to the executives. He played it without saying who it was. They watched in silence. They saw the face. They heard the voice. Slowly, their jaws dropped. The same men who swore to destroy him were now hypnotized. The power dynamic shifted instantly. Just like in 1960, Brando walked into a room without being there and took control. The executives realized they had no choice. They had to hire him. The hunger for a hit outweighed their pride. They offered him the role, but the terms were insulting. Tiny salary, no percentage, and a bond for good behavior. Any other legend would have been insulted. Brando signed. He signed because he knew this wasn't about money anymore. It was about the last laugh. He would take their lowball offer and use it to deliver the greatest performance in history. He would save the studio that hated him, and in doing so, he would make them owe him for eternity. March 15, 1972. The day the world changed. The Godfather premiered. Lines stretched for blocks. Inside, the audience watched, mesmerized. They didn't see the washed-up actor the studio warned them about. They saw Don Corleone. They saw a performance so restrained, so quiet, yet so terrifyingly powerful that it made every other actor look like they were pretending. The critical response was an apology. Journalists who mocked him for years now called him the greatest of his generation. The studio executives, the ones who threw lunches, were suddenly his best friends. They sent champagne. They sent blank checks. The Godfather became the highest-grossing film of all time. Brando had done the impossible. He climbed out of the grave. The industry dug and reached the summit. But if you think this ends with Brando accepting the applause, you haven't been paying attention. Brando didn't want their love or forgiveness. He remembered the cold room. He remembered the betrayal. He knew their applause was fake, rooted only in money. So, he decided to stage one last act of rebellion. A performance that would shock the world even more than the movie itself. The date is March 27, 1973, the 45th Academy Awards. The atmosphere is electric. Everyone knows Brando will win Best Actor. It is the narrative Hollywood loves, the comeback. They prepared standing ovations. They were ready to welcome him back. provided he humbled himself and kissed the ring. Roger Moore and Liv Ullmann stepped to the mic, and the winner is Marlon Brando. The orchestra swelled. Applause erupted. The cameras panned to Brando's seat. It was empty. Instead, a young woman with long dark hair, wearing a traditional Apache dress, stood up. Her name was Soshan Littlefeather. The applause faltered. She walked to the stage. Roger Moore tried to hand her the gold statue. She held up her hand. A stop sign. She refused to touch it. She leaned into the mic. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. "I'm representing Marlon Brando, and he has asked me to tell you that he very regretfully cannot accept this very generous award." The silence was different from the meeting room. It was the silence of shock. Then, a mixture of boos and applause. Chaos. Brando was home on Mulholland Drive, watching on a small TV. He wasn't there to accept validation. He was using their biggest night to protest the mistreatment of Native Americans. He hijacked their signal. He took the moment meant for his glorification and turned it into a mirror for their shame. This was the final checkmate. In 1960, the studio tried to break him by forcing him to speak. In 1973, he broke them by refusing to speak. By sending Littlefeather, he denied the industry the one thing they craved, his submission. He told them, in front of 85 million viewers, that their trophy meant nothing, that it was bigger than their awards. The backlash was furious. John Wayne reportedly wanted to drag Littlefeather off stage. The press attacked Brando, but it didn't matter. He was untouchable. He had the Godfather. He had the fame. He had the immortality. He proved he could burn every bridge, break every rule, and they would still pay him millions because he was simply that good. So, let's go back to that smoke-filled room in 1961 last time. Look at the young Brando, sitting with his cigarette, surrounded by men who wanted to crush him. They told him if he didn't cooperate, he would be forgotten. They told him the system always wins. They were wrong. The executives in that room are gone. Their names are dust. The studio ledgers are trash. But Marlon Brando remains. He proved that an artist's only true leverage is the refusal to compromise. He showed us that silence isn't empty. It's full of answers. He taught us that sometimes, to find your true power, you have to be willing to lose everything. He walked into the dark so he could shine on his own terms, and in the end, the silence he fought for is the only thing we still hear.